All right, earlier today, the House Financial Services Committee considered an issue crucial to the financial markets, and that is the independence of the Federal Reserve if it becomes the single most important regulator for systemic risk. Fed Vice Chairman Donald Cohen testified that the dual roles are not incompatible, but some members of Congress want to exert more control over the Fed, which they argue is already too powerful. How do other Fed officials feel? Well, for that, we turn to Bloomberg's Kathleen Hayes. She's in St. Louis with St. Louis Fed Bank President James Bullard. Kathleen?
Matt, thank you so very much. Yes, in fact, right here within the halls of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, joined by Jim Bullard. Jim, thanks so much.
Thanks for coming. Welcome to the home of the All-Star Game.
Well, next Tuesday.
That's
I'm
right.
sorry I missed it. We'll have to do another interview next week so I can come back and you can get me some tickets. Tickets to another kind of game maybe you wouldn't want to get, and that's watching the Fed. All the criticism now, all the scrutiny of the Fed's independence. Don Cohen testified today. Has the Fed overreached? Has the Fed become the bailout agency that one representative charged today? Is some of this criticism justified?
I think the Fed has been the de facto systemic risk regulator. Whenever, all through this crisis, whenever any problems have come up, people have come to the Fed and looked for solutions. And I think the Fed has tried to be very innovative in trying to meet those challenges with sort of only limited tools. So we had to be very innovative and inventive in trying to react to the crisis.
Did you overreach? Have you gone too far? Does the Fed need to be reined in now?
No, I don't think so. I think people really expect the Fed to do all it can to try to mitigate the downturn and try to solve the financial crisis, and we've done as much as we can. I am very concerned, though, that any kind of hint that you try to take away Fed independence can be very counterproductive at this point in time, because that can give the impression that there might be monetization of the debt, and you'd get rises in longer-term interest rates, and that could be very counterproductive. So hopefully we don't go in that direction.
Well, the GAO conducts audits of the Fed on the banking side, not on the monetary policy side. The House bill that has been signed by about 250 members said there should be audits of monetary policy as well. Is that the kind of thing that you oppose?
Yeah, I think that would be problematic. You've got a situation where you've got very large fiscal deficits, and you've got the Fed buying longer-term Treasury securities. To somebody from outside the U.S., that looks like monetization of the debt, and that can lead to higher interest rates right now, today. So that can be very counterproductive.
And again, if the Fed had audits of monetary policy, why would anybody think that compromised their independence on monetary policy or monetizing the debt? Why wouldn't they think, so what?
Well, the Fed does have a lot of audits right now. We have an internal audit function at all of the reserve banks. We have an oversight function from the Board of Governors. We have an external auditor to try to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley. So there's many different dimensions, and we have the GAO that does audits on many dimensions. So there's a lot of auditing going on. It's just with the monetary policy function that you probably want to keep that at arm's length.
Well, you brought up buying the long-term debt, and this seems to be a lot of where the issue comes from. The Fed is taking these extraordinary measures. Is it time for the Fed to spell out the exit strategy, not just talk about making one? And is the upcoming Humphrey Hawkins testimony in July maybe a good place for the Fed to do that?
Well, I've talked about exit strategy myself. There's been a lot of work on it inside the Federal Reserve, a lot of staff effort thinking about exit strategies. A lot of people say, well, why worry about exit strategy today since you're in the middle of a huge recession? But, longer term, inflation expectations really matter today as far as what investors think is going to happen over the next 5 years. And so that's why you really have to articulate a strategy about what's going to happen over the foreseeable future.
What do you think the exit strategy should be?
Well, on the liquidity programs, the alphabet soup, on those programs, I think it's pretty clear. There's improved performance in the in the arena of financial stress. Those measures have come down. They're better. So I think that for the liquidity programs, those will sort of fade away as the financial markets improve. That will bring a lot of monetary base off our balance sheet, so that's very helpful. But on the other hand, you've got these asset purchase programs. Those are ramping up. We're only about halfway through right now. As we continue to purchase assets, that's adding to the monetary base. At the end of the day, when all the dust settles, you'll have more than doubled the monetary base. That's unprecedented in U.S. Post-war history, and so you could get, it's very reasonable to think that might be inflationary going forward.
So how do you exit? What is the exit strategy?
Well, I think we have tools. We have possible tools that we could use to manage that. We have interest on reserves, for instance. It's a little bit untested, and I think we're still working on that. But I think the main thing is we're going to have to sell assets as appropriate when the time comes, which will be some point, in the future.
Okay.
I want to make it clear, we're not exiting today. We're talking about, the future.
Okay,
yeah.
well, coming up next, I want to talk to Jim Bullard a little bit more about what he's watching when he thinks about that exit strategy and the dangers of inflation ahead. That's next. Welcome back. I'm Kathleen Hayes here at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, an exclusive Bloomberg interview with the president of the St. Louis Fed, Jim Bullard. Jim, headlines just crossing on the Bloomberg that the Fed's balance sheet has fallen below $2 trillion to 1.99. Many of these facilities rolling off. You talked about that, how these temporary lender of last resort facilities naturally roll off. You talked about having to buy assets. The Fed is, sell assets. The Fed has been buying them. What are you watching to know that it's time? What is the strategy? Does the Fed need to tell us what is the plan here?
Well, I think what I'd like to see is kind of a Taylor-type rule for asset purchases, so I'm working on my colleagues to get this, and that's what you'd really like to see. But that way you could see how the asset purchases would be adjusted as information comes in about inflation and about the state of the economy, unemployment, and so on. That's what you'd really like. That's what the Taylor rule is really good at, right? The Taylor rule tells you, I'm going to adjust the interest rate this way or that way depending on how the data comes in. And you'd like something like that for asset purchases. We don't have it yet, but I'm working on my colleagues.
Okay, well, so then let's follow that, though. The bond market maybe is sending a signal right now. The 10-year note yield a month ago at 4%. Now it's down to 3.4%. The recovery is faltering. That's the theme now. Would that be a sign then for the Fed to say, it's time to buy more mortgage debt, more Treasury bonds? Is that the kind of rule you'd like to see?
That's a rule you'd like to see. I don't think the recovery is faltering. I think you've got, if you look at the kinds of projections that were made in December of last year, we're right about on track. I mean, we thought that there'd be a sharp downturn in the fourth quarter, a little less sharp in the first quarter. We thought the second quarter would come in, closer to zero. It'd probably come in -1, -1.5, something like that, on GDP growth I'm talking about, and then get some growth in the second half of the year. I think we're on track for that. I think the market got a little bit ahead of the track that the economy was actually going to follow during this period.
What about inflation? You said that's the medium-term threat in a recent speech, and that theoretically, over 10 years, we could end up with a 7% inflation rate.
Well, if you double the money supply, you're supposed to double the price level. That's what you learned in your money and banking class, and so there's reasons to think that might not happen. There's a lot of slack out there in the economy, but when people talk about inflation risk, that's what they're looking at. You're looking at a doubling of the monetary base. Is that all going to escape into the money supply, go out there and raise all the prices?
What is the biggest risk? The Fed waits too long and lets that inflation rate get out of hand, or the Fed moves too quickly and cuts off the recovery? No.
We have a lot of good people. We're going to have just the right policy to get just the right inflation rate, but that's the judgments that have to be made. I don't buy into the stories about the Fed's going to make a mistake one way or the other going forward.
What is the biggest risk to the recovery right now? And do we need a second stimulus package?
On stimulus, the stimulus package was large, and a lot of it hasn't been spent yet, so I think it was already backloaded, and so it seems to me the thing to do is wait and see how that develops in the second half of the year.
All right. Well, Jim, if you've got time, we want to spend a little more time. There's many questions I want to ask you about, including some questions about bank regulation, too big to fail. This is another issue, of course, that Congress is concerned about, another reason why they're watching the Fed very closely right now. We'll find out what Jim thinks about that. Maybe if he thinks there should be some new ways for guys like him to get their jobs, new ways to select the Fed's district banks. That's all coming up next here on Bloomberg TV as I consider this exclusive interview with Jim Bullard. I'm Kathleen Hayes here at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis with Jim Bullard. And Jim, of course, you took over your job as president of the bank back in April of 2008, just after Bear Stearns was taken over and in the midst of the crisis and Lehman collapsing, all these things. One of the big questions now coming through this crisis is, how do we fix too big to fail? You know, the Treasury's proposed these tougher capital requirements, but if banks can keep selling debt and equity, they can get bigger and bigger and too big to fail yet again. How do you fix it?
Well, I actually think if you look at small bank regulation, that has actually worked, reasonably well during this crisis. There you have, you allow banks to fail, but you have a resolution regime which is credible. So you'd like to get something like that for the big firms. You'd like this credible resolution regime. And the Treasury proposal does address this. Resolution meaning, spell it out for regular folks, take them over. That's your time to be able to take them over, shut them down, whatever you need to do. The FDIC will come in and they'll say on a Friday, and they'll say, I'm sorry, we're closing this institution down. They might open them up on a Monday under a new name. They might sell the deposits off to others. That process works pretty well during the crisis, even though you've got lots of, problems and lots of bank failures. So you'd like something like that for the large institutions, and how to do that, I think, is the crux of the matter in this issue. Would it also be a solution, though, just to change the rules so there are disincentives or rules against big banks taking those outside risks or getting so big, since they have access to the deposit insurance, they have access to the safety net, something that feels more like it used to feel back in the Glass-Steagall days, before that wall between commercial banks and investment banks was broken down? Yeah, I do think that, if you put higher capital requirements on certain firms, in a way that's a kind of a tax on being big. And so I suppose, depending on exactly how that was done, that might disincent firms from getting too big. But I think the biggest issue for these too big to fail companies is really, you're talking about global enterprises and you're talking about global regulatory cooperation. And the Treasury proposal does address that, but of course that's always a very difficult thing to be able to get global cooperation on anything, but especially on financial market regulation. Well, that was the reason, supposedly, we had to break down the Glass-Steagall wall. It only took 10 years to have another financial crisis, mind you, and the argument then was, we have to compete with those foreign banks. Are we going to get sucked into that again and write rules that keep us competitive with foreign banks, but leave American taxpayers, ready to be hung out to dry again? That's why it's hard to get the global cooperation, is because everybody's tempted to try to lure firms to their country and to try to relax requirements in their particular country. So it's a tall order to get cooperation across borders. I want to ask you some more about this whole question of the Fed and this people looking at the Fed again. And even people like Henry Kaufman, who's a longtime Fed watcher, thinks maybe it's time to take another look. Let's run through a couple of simple things, like how the district bank presidents are selected. Should that be subjected to oversight by the president, by the Congress? I mean, can you really justify this independent district bank structure we have now? Well, I think it's a great design to get. You really want the input from around the nation, and you do want a degree of independence there. But all the presidents have to get approved by the Board of Governors at the end of the day anyway. So I think there's plenty of checks and balances in that process. It's served us well for almost 100 years here, and so I think we could. That part doesn't seem to be working badly. I'm also wondering, as a Fed official, and you've been there just over a year, really, a big deal, an email from Jeff Flacker to Ben Bernanke discussing the Bank of America's takeover of Merrill got a lot of scrutiny. I don't want to ask you about that in particular, but when you have people looking over your shoulder like that, when you're being broadly second-guessed like this, does it make it harder for the Fed to make monetary policy right now, to navigate out of this tricky time of not being too easy, not being too tight, not exiting too fast, too slow, et cetera? I don't mind. It's public policy, and you're trying to do the best you can. And absolutely, you want people to be asking questions, and you want to try to explain policy as best you can. So, no, I don't think that part doesn't bother me.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Let's leave it there. Jim, thanks so much for joining Bloomberg TV today. We're so glad you took the time. Kathleen Hayes, again, an exclusive Bloomberg interview. Jim Bullard, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Not mind that people are looking over his shoulder. I guess that's why he led us to the bank today. Back to you, Matt.
It makes him even better. All right, Kathleen, thanks for